What you are witnessing is the first genuine sovereign default of 2026, and it unfolded before Wall Street even had a chance to power up. This is not an exercise. It is not a rumor spreading online, and it is not a hypothetical scenario. This is a confirmed event coming directly from port authorities in Shanghai, as of December 31st at 11:47 p.m. local time. Officials began refusing silver shipments that were destined for COMEX-approved vaults in the United States. The default clock is not about to begin ticking. It already struck zero. And when New York reached out to Beijing for an emergency backstop, the call did not merely go unanswered. Beijing effectively ended the conversation. China declined. No bailout, no negotiations, no counterproposal, just a firm refusal. Earlier today, I explained that the system had roughly 48 hours before hitting a hard deadline. That timetable has now completely collapsed. Those 48 hours have compressed into less than 8. As sources inside China confirmed something that was never supposed to occur until January 1st. The newly announced export restrictions on strategic metals are being enforced early, not at midnight on New Year's Day, but right now. And COMEX is set to open on January 2nd, facing a physical delivery crisis that cannot be solved with additional paper contracts. This is the point of no return for the silver market. This is where a synthetic pricing structure, built on leverage and derivatives, collides head-on with the reality that the physical metal simply does not exist at the listed price or at any price at all. Once the physical supply disappears, the mathematical framework supporting the paper market breaks down, and over the past 12 hours, while much of the world was focused on ringing in the new year, the individuals who actually keep the system running were scrambling at 4,000 feet, trying to prevent this exact outcome. What follows is a reconstruction of events based on flight tracking data, exchange communications, and first-hand accounts from those directly involved. At Doi, Peißberzeche M. Eastern Time yesterday. A Gulfstream jet departed JFK en route to Hong Kong. Public flight records reveal the tail number and destination, but the passenger manifest is fully redacted. Observers at the terminal say this was not a leisure flight. On board were senior executives from a major U.S. Banks Commodities Division, at least one high-level regulator, and an official connected to a regional Federal Reserve Bank. Consider this carefully. Why would a regional branch of the Federal Reserve be involved in what appears, on the surface, to be a private metals transaction? Because this is not about a shipment of silver bars. It is about the infrastructure of the global financial system. The consequences move through swap desks, margin requirements, and collateral chains, reaching the heart of the banking system in a matter of days. Everyone on that aircraft understood the stakes. That is why a central banking official was seated next to a commodities trader at cruising altitude, attempting to assemble a last-minute solution before the holiday window closed. The jet landed in Hong Kong at 6:40 a.m. local time on December 31st. By 9:15 a.m., the delegation had crossed the water and was seated inside a secured conference room at the headquarters of the Shanghai Futures Exchange. There were no cameras and no media presence. Just a small group of Americans, a table of Chinese officials, and a single proposal, the U-8219. Delegation presented one straightforward offer, an emergency purchase of 50 million ounces of silver approved for immediate export. Payment would not be made in sanctionable U.S. dollars, but instead through U.S. Treasuries structured within a bilateral currency swap. This structure completely bypassed the SWIFT system. Legal teams had carefully navigated an obscure exemption from the 2019 Phase 1 trade agreement, classifying the transaction as a strategic reserve transfer rather than a commercial export, thereby attempting to sidestep the new Chinese export law scheduled to take effect on January 1st. On paper, the strategy was technically sound. In reality, it reeked of last-minute desperation. Beijing accepted the documents, stepped out of the room, and reviewed them for just over half an hour. Not days, not weeks, exactly 37 minutes. Then the head of the People's Bank of China's Metals Division returned, made eye contact with the American delegation, and delivered a single word. No, not we need more time. Not adjust the price. No renegotiation. Just no. The meeting concluded at 10:52 a.m. Shanghai time. By 1:30 p.m., the American delegation was back on the aircraft, and by 4 p.m. Eastern Time, the first Shanghai port began stamping silver containers bound for U.S. vaults with 3 words Wall Street did not want to see. Export clearance denied. This is not internet speculation. 3 independent logistics firms specializing in refined bullion transport have reported the same situation. Pallets of silver fully packed, containers sealed, trucks idling with no destination. The documentation now bears a red stamp halting shipment, pending regulatory compliance review. That phrase is a signal. It means the new export controls are not a future risk. They are in force now, and they are being used to lock down last-minute physical supply headed for the United States. So let's be absolutely clear about what this represents. Through back channels. The U, he's S. Government quietly attempted to secure a massive quantity of physical silver from China to prevent COMEX from unraveling, and China said no. There was no attempt to extract a higher price, no demand for alternative collateral. The entire premise of the deal was rejected. From the moment that no was spoken, this stopped being about pricing. This is about control of real assets in a system dominated by paper IOUs. Beijing looked at the U and SS derivative structure and effectively said, you operate a casino of promises. We hold the metal, and we will not drain our strategic reserves to save your paper market. When mainstream media eventually covers this, it will not be framed this way. It will be described as a trade disagreement. You will hear about tariffs, compliance procedures, and routine enforcement of revised export regulations. Bloomberg will likely dress this up with a carefully chosen euphemism. CNBC will put a well-groomed analyst on camera to calmly explain that commodity flows are merely being rebalanced. What you will not hear is anyone asking the uncomfortable questions why a Federal Reserve official was on that aircraft, why the CFTC needed a seat in what was supposedly a private commercial discussion, or why a straightforward metals purchase required approval from 2 governments and the use of a currency swap. If those questions were asked openly, the answer would be unavoidable. The paper market is shaking because the metal backing it largely is not there. So what actually happens when COMEX opens on January 2nd? As of the close on December 30th, roughly 120,000 futures contracts were still standing for January delivery. Each contract represents 5,000 ounces, which translates into about 60 million ounces of silver that, on paper, must be delivered during the month. The most recent figures showed approximately 41 million ounces categorized as registered, meaning they are theoretically ready for delivery. It does not take a mathematician to spot the problem. 60 million owed, 41 million available, leaving a shortfall of roughly 19 million ounces before accounting for any delays, withdrawals, or disruptions. Now add the detail that no one on television is going to emphasize. Of that 41 million ounces, more than half, around 23 million, was never physically sitting in New York vaults. It was expected to arrive in early January, largely refined in Chinese facilities and shipped, as you might expect, through Shanghai. Those shipments are now frozen, trapped behind paperwork stamped in red. In practical terms, COMEX does not actually have 41 million ounces ready to deliver. It has closer to 18 million ounces that are physically present and immediately available. Run the numbers. 60 million ounces promised, 18 million on hand. That leaves roughly 42 million ounces of demand with nothing to satisfy it. That is a deficit of about 70%. In anything resembling a functioning free market, a gap of that size in deliverable inventory would force a violent repricing. Futures would surge, short positions would rush to cover, longs would fight to take delivery, and prices would move sharply until real metal came out of hiding. That is how price discovery is supposed to operate. But this is not that kind of market. This is a system where prices are driven by leveraged paper trades, and the underlying asset has just been removed from circulation by the one major supplier willing to say no. If you want to see how the rule makers respond when that happens, you do not need an insider leak. You can read it yourself. Buried on the CME Group's website at 1134 p.m. Eastern on December 30th. An emergency notice quietly appeared under an intentionally dull headline, Temporary Position, Limit Modifications under Force Majeure Conditions. It runs 8 pages of legal language, but only one paragraph truly matters. Tucked away in Section 4, the clearinghouse gives itself authority in cases where physical delivery cannot reasonably be completed due to circumstances beyond the exchange's control, to mandate cash settlement at the prevailing futures price, with no penalty applied to the short side. Translated out of legal language, this means that before the most critical delivery month even begins, the exchange is reserving the right to say, you are not getting the metal you contracted for. You will receive cash instead, at a price we determine, and the party that failed to deliver will face no additional cost. That is not risk management. It is the advance approval of a default, dressed up with the label force majeure to give it an air of legitimacy. And the timing matters. Who is carefully reading CME rule updates on position limits at 1134p? And on December 30th, while most people are getting ready for New Year's Eve, not retail traders, not pension funds. That timing sends a message to a very specific audience. The large banks that need reassurance, the rules will be adjusted in their favor before trading resumes. Here is what that means in practical terms for anyone still holding a January futures contract under the assumption they will receive physical silver. When the music stops, they are likely to be handed a cash payment tied to a futures price, somewhere around $30 an ounce. Meanwhile, physical silver in Shanghai is reportedly trading closer to $90. A gap of $50 to $60 per ounce between the real-world price of metal and the forced settlement value is not a minor discrepancy. It is legalized confiscation, carried out in plain sight through obscure rule changes that almost no one reads. Now, pull back from the silver market itself and look at the financial plumbing underneath. While the public was watching the ball drop in Times Square, the Federal Reserve quietly injected $34 billion into the overnight repo market. On the surface, the explanation will sound routine year-end funding pressures, normal liquidity operations. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for one detail. Just days earlier, on December 29th, that injection was roughly $4 billion. On December 30th, it rose to about $6 billion. Then, on December 31st, it suddenly surged to $34 billion, an increase of more than 8 times in just 48 hours. Markets do not suddenly require 8 times more overnight cash because traders are in a celebratory mood. They need it because major institutions are facing collateral calls they cannot meet. The repo market exists for banks that have acceptable collateral but lack immediate cash, and they only need that cash overnight to remain compliant. When the Fed has to open the liquidity fire hose on New Year's Eve, it signals that more than one major institution was at risk of failing that test. And when that spike occurs on the same day, China shuts down emergency silver exports, it does not take a conspiracy mindset to connect the dots. Silver is not a fringe asset. It is used as posted collateral behind an estimated $200 to $250 billion in derivative exposure within the U.S. banking system alone. Here's the core mechanism at work. A large bank, such as JP Morgan, sells silver futures that are not fully backed by physical bars. To offset that exposure, it purchases derivatives, swaps, and options from other counterparties. Those instruments are all priced off the COMEX benchmark, the paper price, which is shaped by algorithmic trading, high-frequency strategies, and, when necessary, outright suppression. As long as physical silver can be sourced somewhere globally at a modest premium to the paper price, the system functions. Banks can quietly enter the market, pay slightly above spot, deliver the metal, and square the books. That process only holds together as long as physical metal is actually available for sale. Once Shanghai decides it will not ship, that small premium instantly becomes a chasm. At the moment, the future settlement price in New York sits in the low $30 range, while spot prices for immediate physical delivery in Shanghai are hovering near $90. That is a spread approaching $60 per ounce. Now put yourself in the position of a bank that sold futures at $30, expecting Chinese refiners to supply the metal, and suddenly the counterparty demands delivery. You do not have the bars to perform. You must acquire physical silver in a market pricing it at $90. You deliver $90 metal to satisfy a $30 obligation, locking in a $60 loss per ounce. Multiply that by the roughly 42 million ounces that COMEX cannot cover with registered inventory, and you are looking at around $2, $5 billion in direct realized losses, and that only reflects the exchange-traded exposure. The larger danger sits in the over-the-counter swaps and structured products sold to pension funds, hedge funds, and corporations as hedges. Once those buyers understand that the exchange is forcing cash settlement and the physical supply has vanished, they will begin enforcing every clause of those contracts. That is where the estimated $230 billion in notional exposure becomes critical. At that point, the situation starts to feel familiar. Cascading claims, counterparties growing uneasy, collateral that is not where everyone assumed it was, different asset, same storyline. It begins to resemble 2008, with silver bars replacing subprime mortgages. So the Federal Reserve floods the repo market to ensure banks can meet overnight funding requirements. The CME adjusts its own rulebook to protect short positions from meaningful penalties, and the official narrative machine moves into place, assuring the public that everything remains under control. You will be told silver's price movement is merely profit-taking after a speculative surge. You will hear that China's export restrictions are just routine enforcement adjustments, and that the spike in repo activity is standard for year-end conditions. Those explanations are not accidental. They are designed to buy time while institutions closest to the impact zone reposition themselves. The uncomfortable truth is that the paper-silver market has entered the early phase of a structural breakdown. The rescue effort did not succeed. The supplier of last resort chose to hold onto its metal. The exchange has already put the framework in place to rewrite the rules mid-game. While the central bank rushes in to plug leaks in the system with tens of billions of dollars in overnight liquidity, what you are witnessing, in real time, is a default that is simply not being labeled as one. Agreements that promised physical metal are being quietly converted into cash payments at prices that no longer reflect the real-world market where silver is actually melted, manufactured, and used. This is what a modern sovereign default looks like when the failure is not a missed bond payment, but a broken commodity obligation. A government and its financial system built an enormous structure of leverage on top of a metal supply they do not control. The moment the true holders of that metal decided to stop cooperating, the illusion began to fracture. From this point forward, the divide between paper claims and tangible resources is no longer an abstract concept. It is appearing directly on balance sheets, flashing as widening spreads on trading screens, and becoming a reality that those in charge are desperate for the public not to grasp, at least not until they have already secured their own escape routes.